Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Asia Trains Public Lecture Series. Today's lecture is organized by the Changing Family in Asia Research Cluster in the Asia Research Institute in collaboration with the National Public Library. We first of all, thank the Public Library for its kindness to provide these facilities. Glad to see you all. I'm glad to see some familiar faces that I remember from previous years for this. Before I introduce our speaker tonight, let me tell you a little bit about the Asia Research Institute for those who don't know much about our organization. Asia Research Institute, or ARI as we call it, was established in 2001 as a university level of research institute by the National University of Singapore. So we're now into our second decade of our institutional life now. And the aim of the ARI is to become a hub for scholars that are interested in doing research on Asia. Particularly focusing on humanities and social sciences work. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Jin Yang. I'm the research leader of the Changing Family in Asia Cluster, and I am going to be chairing today's session tonight. ARI, as I was speaking, hosts scholars, many different kinds of scholars from different disciplines, history, social science, and humanities, sociology, economics, social work, and so on. And we bring all these different scholars together. Some of us are long-term research staffs. It's a small group of long-term research staff. We also house short-term visiting fellows, research professors, postdocs, to do collaborate research together. And at ARI, we organize our research into several different clusters. In addition to the Changing Family in Asia clusters, there's the Migration cluster, there's the Culture in Asia cluster, there's the Religion cluster, there's Science and Technology cluster, and there's Asian Urbanism clusters. There's also an open cluster that sort of fits work that doesn't quite fit precisely in any one of those clusters. And each cluster holds seminars, workshops, conferences throughout the year. We have a lot of workshops. In fact, almost every month you can have up to 10 conferences and workshops that's going on in either in ARI, which is in Bukit Timah campus, or different parts of the Singapore. Changing Family in Asia cluster does look at different dimensions of families that are changing in Asia. That includes marriage, fertility behavior, also includes intergenerational relations, gender relations, and children's development, or youth transitioning to adulthood, different aspects of families that are changing around Asia. And we've been holding different kind of workshops throughout the years. We disseminate our the work through journals, articles, books, and opinion ads in the newspapers and so on. Asia Trends is an activity that ARI hosts annually. It's a flagship event that it's a main way for us, ARI, to communicate and interact with the general public, to disseminate some of our research findings. And this year, this is the final public lectures that we hold. And every cluster invite leading scholars to speak on an important topic to that cluster. Then we also invite local scholars to comment on things that happens around Singapore, at least in the neighboring areas, on that particular issues or trends. So this is a very important time for us to interact with the public, and we're very happy that you joined us for this event. Today, we're talking about educational attainment and family background. We're very fortunate to have a distinguished speaker tonight. Our speaker, Professor Don Treiman, is a distinguished professor of sociology emeritus from the University of California, Los Angeles. We're very fortunate that Professor Treiman is now visiting ARI as a visiting research professor in our cluster, and he's been with us for the past 2.5 months until the end of the year. Professor Treiman is a leading scholar in the field of social stratification and intergenerational social mobility, particularly he looks at these issues from cross-national perspectives. He does a lot of work on China. He also looks at situations in South Asia, East European countries as well. So, and he has a lot of publications, books, and journal articles that are very well highly cited in this discipline. Together with his collaborator, Professor Don Treiman has been working on a long-term cross-national project that looked at status attainment process across nations throughout the world. And they have already compiled a whole archive of nearly 500 sample surveys from more than 50 countries, from more than 50 different countries all over the world. And from there, Professor Don Treiman is going to share with us some of his findings about educational attainment and what family background has to do with how the educational attainment process. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Don Treiman to speak tonight.
Thank you, Jean, and thank you, Ari, for inviting me to speak, and thank all of you for coming. Let's see if I can manage the technology here. Oops, I'm supposed to find, how do I get my own slides? Henry, help. I'm a Luddite. Ah, there it is. Okay, very good. Thank you. Okay, excellent. Okay, this is work that I'm doing with my Dutch colleague, Professor Harry Ganzenboom, and as Jean said, this is part of a long-term project in which we are compiling data from many countries, starting with sample surveys conducted as far back as 1947, and we continue to add to our collection, but we decided it was time to actually begin to do some work to share some results with you and not just keep on collecting more and more data. So I'm going to talk to you about cross-national and cross-temporal variations in inequality of opportunity. And I'll explain that in a moment. And I'm going to ask how inequality of opportunity, which is essentially the dependence of educational, this is inequality of educational opportunity, I should have said, and it's the dependence of educational attainment on the social status of one's family and on descriptive characteristics such as gender and ethnicity. So the question is, how do patterns of inequality of educational opportunity vary across societies, and why is it important to know this? And then I'm going to look at the empirical evidence on this question, and then I'm going to take a closer look at Asian nations And I keep narrowing down, so then I'm going to look at factors affecting educational attainment in China, and then try to draw some conclusions from all this. So the beginning is the observation that education is central to both social reproduction and social mobility. Social reproduction refers to the extent to which people follow their parents, and the children of high-status parents themselves acquire high-status positions. And social mobility is the extent to which they escape from their social origin, to which people escape or are driven, I should say, from their social origins. Because if you're upwardly mobile, it's an escape, and if you're downwardly mobile, it's an escape of a kind, but not one that you're necessarily eager to have experienced. In any event, insofar as education is independent of social origins, educational attainment is the central engine of social mobility. It's the central basis by which people are able to achieve their own positions. And insofar as education depends on social origins, it's the principal vehicle by which state is transmitted from one generation to the next. Educational expansion is also closely linked, or is closely linked, to economic development. And I would suggest that national success in the 21st century will almost certainly be driven by how well educated a nation's workforce is, just as has been true of the 20th century. This fact, I think, is recognized by the governments of China, Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan, others as well. Also by the U.S. President, President Obama, who keeps pressing the point that to compete in the world, Americans have to become better educated. Now, when you think about what is it that would allow a society to produce a more educated citizenry, a more educated workforce, the only way that this is really possible is to increase access to education for those of low status origins, and to remove barriers that depend on things like gender and on race or ethnicity. So it's by giving opportunity to people who are in the disadvantaged part of the population, by giving educational opportunity, that's the way to increase the average education of the population. And so that indeed is what I'm studying, is what are the factors that lead to national variations and variations over time in the extent to which education is dependent upon the social status of one's parents, or in this analysis, on gender. And understanding variations in inequality of educational opportunity, as I just said, is central to knowing how to expand education. It's also crucial in understanding the sources of inequality, to create which is necessary to create more just societies in which people have equal opportunity. That's certainly an American value. I suspect it's actually a worldwide value, and increasingly a worldwide value over the 20th century and into the 21st century. So in this analysis, Professor Gansenbaum and I, asked specifically how and why does inequality of educational opportunity vary across societies and over time. So let me say a word about our strategy for studying this. And it's a little bit technical, but I will try to be clear and not too technical. And I think now I'm actually getting to work, so it's time to take off my clothes and get to work here. What we do is that we divide all of our data into schooling contexts. Schooling contexts are defined as people in a given nation who were age 10 during specific 5-year periods. Now we can do this. We can divide our sample up in this way because we have compiled actually more than 500 surveys at the moment. The truth is we have about 600 or 700 surveys, but some of them, there's a lot of data processing involved, a lot of work involved in standardizing these data across across studies and across nations. So at the moment, we have 541 national sample surveys in which people have been asked questions about themselves, their parents, their circumstances, and so on. So we have 541 national sample surveys from 54 nations that for some nations cover most of the 20th century. From 1900, the 5-year schooling cohort is 1900 to 1904. That is people who were age 10 during that 5-year period. And then the most recent cohorts are in our data are schooling cohorts of people who are age 10 between 1990 and 1990. That's an error. That should be 1994, not 1904. So if we cross countries by contexts, we get 661, countries by cohorts, countries by these different schooling cohorts. We get 661 contexts with complete data. If you do the arithmetic, you'll notice that 54 times 500 and, 54 times about 20 or 21 cohorts is a lot more than 661. But for many countries, we don't have data covering the whole period. We have countries only for relatively recent, the surveys that have been done only recently. In those countries, we have data for only recent cohorts. And when we exclude missing data and exclude and restrict our analysis to context with at least 100 cases in the context, we end up with 661 cases. We start with about 1.8 million interviews, and we end up with about 1.1 million interviews after we restrict the analysis to people age 25 to 75 who are in context with complete data. And that's our analytic sample. So then what we do is that within each context, we estimate a simple model of inequality of educational opportunity. We predict the years of schooling from father's years of schooling, occupational status, and gender. So it's a very simple model. We ask to what extent how much schooling people get depend upon how much schooling their father had, their father's occupational status. There's a standard international measure, which actually Ganzelblum and I and our colleague Paul de Graaf from the Netherlands created. And then we ask whether there are schooling differences between men and women, differences in average schooling, holding constant father's occupational status and respondents' years of schooling. And we do this separately for each context. So say, let's take, if we don't have Singapore data, but if we had Singapore data, we might have we might have people who are age 10 in 1950 to 1954, and so we do this microanalysis for that group, and then people who are age 10 from 1955 to 1955 to 1959, and we do the microanalysis for that group, and so on for each of the 661 contexts. And then we turn around and we treat the outcomes of the microanalysis as input to a macroanalysis. And we ask to what extent variations in the degree to which education is dependent upon social origins and gender, it depends on certain macro characteristics, in particular the level of development of a country, time, as we progress through the 20th century, whether the nation has a communist regime or not whether that context in that period has a communist regime or not, and then we consider the possibility that the effect of the communist regime varies over time. And then we get to some conclusions about the way that nations and the way that time periods vary in the extent to which education depends on social origins and gender, and the way in which how it is independent of those things. So let me say something about our theory and our hypotheses. So first I talk about the micro model, the model predicting the determinants of years of schooling within each context. People from, and it's very simple and straightforward and won't surprise anybody, but it still is useful to be explicit. People who come from educated families tend to do better and go further in school due to schooling relevant skills learned at home, the presence of books, family emphasis on education, and so on. So no surprise, people from educated families go further in school. And we measure educated families here by father's education, because we don't have mother's education for a lot of the surveys, for a number of the surveys. We also think that father's occupational status helps, both because it is correlated with income, which nobody ever has income from. If you have income when people were children in sample surveys, if I ask you, well, what was your father's income, or what was your parents' income when you were 14 years old, I doubt that any of you could tell me. I certainly could not say what my family income was when I was 14, and because of that, people in doing these kinds of surveys never ask that question. So we approximate it by father's occupational status, which tends to be not entirely, but relatively constant over time. And we ask what kind of work the father did when the people we're interviewing were age 14, and we take that as partially a proxy for income and partially a proxy for the intellectual demandingness of jobs. We claim that because higher status jobs are likely to be more intellectually demanding, making the fathers who have such jobs better role models and better at transmitting school-relevant skills to their children, we expect fathers' occupational status to help to determine people's own education, to determine how far people go to school. And finally, we have a hypothesis about the educational disadvantage of girls. Until recently, and in many places still, the education of girls was devalued or discouraged. I mean, we only need to read the newspapers and look at what's happening in Afghanistan and places like that, where women get set upon, people try to kill them or maim them just because they're trying to go to school. But in other places where it's not as extreme, it's still the case that, that in many countries, and certainly until recently, the education of boys was regarded as more important than educating girls. And the reasons for it is several. Sons continued the family line, so their success mattered more. Sons were thought to be better old age insurance, such as in China, where there is no, certainly in the rural areas, there is no public old age insurance, and so better have a son who will take care of you in your old age than a daughter. In patrilineal societies where the girls move away, educating girls was thought to bring no benefit to parents. What good is it to educate her when we don't get any benefit from it because she goes and she helps out her husband's family? So China and also other places. And finally, in many places, particularly the Arab nations and other Muslim nations such as Afghanistan, the domain of women was the household, and education was not regarded as important. So we expect girls to get less education than boys. Now let's consider factors affecting the macro process, affecting variations in educational attainment over nations and time. The more developed a nation, the greater the demand for educated labor, and the more public resources available for investment in education. Thus, we would expect higher average schooling, which is technically an increase in the intercept term of the microequation, and a reduction in inequality of educational opportunity, that is, a reduction in the effects of father's education, father's occupation, and female gender on educational attainment. We also expect that the greater the educational inequality, the greater the inequality of opportunity. And here we specifically focus on the effects of father's education and father's occupational status. We can think of educational inequality, which is easily measured from the data. It's the standard deviation of education in the data set, as a proxy for social inequality more generally, are reflecting differences in what are known as material and social capital. Actually, it should be cultural capital, not social capital. Sorry, another mistake. In both material and cultural capital. And the idea is that where inequality is high, the advantage of being from high status origins is greater than when inequality is low. If you think about the difference between somebody who comes from a family where, say, the father has 14 years of schooling and somebody who comes from a family where the father has 12 years of schooling, it's not a huge difference in terms of the ability of the kid to manage his own way or her own way in school. But imagine now a father who has 14 years of schooling versus a father who has 4 years of schooling. It may be very difficult for the child of the son or daughter of the man with 4 years of schooling to manage in the school. The differences in values, in skills, and so on are so large that it creates all sorts of disadvantages in terms of doing well in school in that situation. So the greater the education inequality, the greater the inequality of opportunity is the hypothesis. There's been a worldwide trend over the 20th century away from laissez-faire state policies and toward welfare state policies. So there's an assumption that government should play a greater role in providing for welfare, including education. It's not true everywhere, but the general trend is certainly in that direction. And this should reduce inequality of educational opportunity, including the gender gap, for successive cohorts, that is, as we proceed through the 20th century. And should also expand education. Communist regimes tend to promote education as a vehicle of both social control and economic development. Moreover, they promote female education in order to expand the educated workforce. And therefore, we expect positive effects for the intercept and a reduction in inequality of educational opportunity. And finally, we expect that the effect of communism or communist regime should diminish over time as regimes lose their revolutionary fervor. I think I should speed this up a little bit in order to get through the whole thing. So this is a summary of our expectations. It just essentially just in diagrammatic way summarizes what I just said. The data, as I mentioned, are 541 surveys from 54 nations. There are 14 former or current, China is the only current, quote, communist, end quote, nations. There are 9 Asian nations, as you see, China, Cyprus, India, Israel, Japan, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Turkey. Later, when I look at individual nations, I'm going to drop Cyprus and Israel as being not quite what we usually think of as Asian nations, even though they are. And then we have 3 Latin American nations, 2 African nations, and 27 others, which are mostly Western European and British diaspora places, Canada, the U.S., Australia, New Zealand, so on. Okay, here's the first set of results. The micro model in which we predict education is given by the equation that you see up there. And what that equation tells us is if we compare people in a given nation at a given point in time, we would expect that those whose fathers differ by a year of schooling can be expected to differ in their own schooling by about a third of a year. That's pretty standard. Of course, it should be. I mean, we've got data from lots of places, and so the average will turn out to be sort of similar to what everybody else finds in other studies. Those whose fathers differ by 10 points on the ISEI. The ISEI scale is the measure of occupational status. People who differ by 10 points on the scale, which, for example, the difference between an engineer and a real estate agent, or a truck driver and a janitor, can be expected to differ by nearly half a year of schooling. And finally, women get, on average, among women who are equally, whose fathers are equally well educated, and whose fathers have jobs of the same status, women will tend to get about a half a year less on average than men. And the intercept, going back to that, the 10.1, where's my laser pointer? Because of the way that I've defined these variables, this tells us the average, the expected years of schooling for people whose fathers have average education and average occupational status. So that's about 10 years of schooling, which is pretty high. But many nations toward the end of the century have have quite high average schooling. Okay, now to the macro results. The results are mostly as expected. The average level of education increases with modernization, increases over time, is slightly higher than expected at the outset of most communist regimes, which is around 1950, but lower than expected at the end of most communist regimes, which is about 1990. I think all communist regimes except for China. The effect of fathers' education declines over time, increases with inequality, and is reduced in communist regimes, but more at the beginning than at the end. Oddly, modernization, and I should say, I haven't said how I measure it, but modernization is measured by a very crude measure. It's the percentage of the labor force that is in that does neither agricultural work nor traditional sales work. So it's a pretty weak measure of modernization, and we're going to try to substitute something like a gross domestic product. The problem is we don't have data on things like GDP that go back through into the early years of the 20th century. So for the first analysis, we took a measure that we could compute directly from the data. And it works mostly, but not in this particular case. The effect of fathers' occupational status declines with modernization, increases with inequality, declines over time, and is reduced in communist regimes. There's no change over time in the effect of communist regime on the effect of the dependence of education on fathers' occupational status. And finally, women gain relative to men, not finally actually, because I have to say something about communism. Women gain relative to men in more modernized societies over time, and in communist societies, although the communist advantage essentially disappears by the end of regimes, that is by around 1990. And I don't actually have to say anything more about women, about communism, because I've incorporated that in. So this is a summary of the findings, and I'm not going to go over the figures, which require some elaboration. If you want to talk about them, let's ask about them during the Q&A. But let me just focus on the bottom line. The bottom line is the expected difference between extremes. That is the expected difference in average education, in education, or the determinants of education, between the least modernized countries in 1900 and the most modernized countries in 1990. And so that is 8 years of schooling. On average, the difference between the least and most developed countries, between the extremes, is 8 years of schooling. The effect of fathers' education declines by about 0.3, which is a very large percentage. Not percentage, a very large number. So this is a big effect. The effect of fathers' occupation also declines, so that's a big effect. And women gain about 2.2 years of schooling, which is to say the gap between men and women not only closes, but it reverses. So that in the most modern countries at the end of the 20th century, women actually have, on average, more schooling than men do. So what this tells us is that modernization has big effects, and and there have been big changes over the course of the 20th century in the extent to which education depends on social origins and the extent to which there is a penalty, an educational penalty experienced by women. Now, let me, so that's what I've just said here. Now let me go to Asia, and I want to look at a number of Asian countries, first considering trends in years of schooling over time, and then considering differences between actual years of schooling and the expectations of our macro model. This is a graph of average years of schooling over time from over the course of the 20th century, and this is the year at which people are aged 10 to 14. This is 1904, 1994. Notice that there is this is India, which is limping along, although in fact it starts going up. We don't have Indian survey data for very recently. We're going to get some, but we don't have them yet. And it starts going up in India as well. But the main thing, the most striking thing about this graph is that, I realize I should be closer to the mic. The most striking thing about this graph is for China. China has a dramatic increase in education, and Taiwan. The blue solid line is Taiwan, going up here. So both China and Taiwan are increasing education much faster than the other countries. And that's the main takeaway point from this graph. So then we asked, well, how do countries do relative to what we would expect on the basis of their degree of modernization and the point in time that we're looking at them, and for that matter, a communist regime when there were communist regimes. And what we discover is that everybody, well, there's Malaysia, for which we don't have very recent data, starts off and then seems to decline again. The real story is again Taiwan and China. Look how dramatically China has, this is Taiwan, sorry, how dramatically Taiwan has exceeded the expectations of the model, and how even more dramatically China has exceeded the expectations of the model. So these are two countries where there's much more investment in education, much greater educational attainment than you would expect given this rather crude measure that we have of modernization. And this is really an important point, and I'll return to that in a moment. But before I do that, I want to focus on China and talk and show you a rather more elaborated model of a micro model of the factors that affect educational attainment in China. The thing about the overarching analysis is that the analysis of the 54 countries over the 20th century is that we couldn't add in a lot of variables because they didn't exist in a lot of surveys. So we had to stick to a very simple model. But when we look at a single country, you can do a lot more elaborate job of explaining educational attainment. So the first thing I'm going to do is to look at some trends. This is, and unfortunately there's something odd about the way that Stata translates into PowerPoint. I should have made these thicker lines, but because I don't think you can see the differences in the colors very well, but still, they follow this order. This is a graph showing the percentage with at least some amount of schooling. So this is the percentage with primary schooling, and the percentage with lower middle schooling, upper middle schooling, short cycle, tertiary, and university. There's a break here because I used two censuses, the census of 1982, so that I could get data back a long way, and the census of 2010, and they don't give exactly the same answers. And the reason they don't give exactly the same answers is due to differential mortality. is that the poorly educated people tend to die off faster. So the 2010 estimates are higher than the corresponding estimates from the 1982 census, because it doesn't have the 2010 census doesn't have nearly as many of the poorly educated people because they've already died. Mortality starts going up in a linear way at 1930. At age 30, and linearly through age 90, and there's a very strong differential mortality by education. So that's what accounts for these gaps. But you can still see the story. So the story about China is that China achieved essentially universal primary education by the early 1960s. And for lower middle schooling, it didn't get really high until the end of the 20th century. And there are even smaller numbers of people going to upper middle school and then the two kinds of tertiary schooling. These numbers are actually going up very rapidly right now, and we'll see that in a minute. So China achieved an improvement in the education of its population, mostly by focusing on the bottom end, mostly by radically increasing the number of people who had at least a lower middle school education. And by the end of the century, this is about around 90%. And so now they have a legal school leaving age of 16, and almost everybody in China gets 6 years of primary school and 3 years of lower middle school. And then they're now rapidly increasing the higher levels of education. There's a bump here, a downward trend here, which represents the Great Leap Forward famine, when people didn't go to school as much; they were too busy trying to find food. So there was a permanent cost to the Great Leap Forward cohorts. And then there was a bump in lower middle and especially upper middle school during the Cultural Revolution, when many rural schools were opened, and people who never went to school before were able to go to school. But at the end of the Cultural Revolution, they shut all that down. And so things came back down. It also have to do with the family responsibility system, in which the communes were divided up, and people were given, individual families were given plots of land, and were told that they could sell anything above what they had to pay in the in-kind grain tax. They could sell on the open market. So the opportunity cost of leaving kids in school got much bigger. So it's some combination of those two things. This is for men. This is the same story for women. It's just a little lower, but it's essentially the same story. And then this shows each level of schooling for men and women together. So this is primary, lower middle, and so on. Be careful, because these are on different scales. So notice this goes from 0 to 0.1, whereas this goes from 0 to 1. But what you do see is everywhere a dramatic increase relative to earlier years. And the most important thing about this graph is that it shows that there's a convergence in the education of men and women. So that China has achieved gender equality, and I think, like many countries, now actually has more educated women than educated men in its cohorts. Okay, now let's consider the determinants of educational attainment in China. I've been told I have 5 minutes, so I'll be quick. As I say, we can go beyond the simple model used for the comparative analysis by considering parental education. I average fathers and mothers' education. We had fathers' occupational status in the earlier model, the comparative model, and gender there also. But here we consider place of residence and registration residential status, that is rural versus urban, and registration status, whether you have a rural or urban registration. We consider cultural capital, which is the number of books in the household for people who are age 14, which, as we will see, is more important than parental education, and whether there's a desk in the household. And then we consider political capital, whether at least one parent is a party member, a Communist Party member. The data are a 1996 national probability sample of Chinese adults that I collected with Chinese colleagues and Andrew Waldner from Stanford. Now, before I get to the data, here's a picture in Hebei province of about, I guess, 60 or 70 kilometers outside of Beijing, of a young girl's desk. This is the young girl. Notice city girl. But she was a lower middle school student who was who did well in lower middle school, was expecting to do well, to be admitted to a good university. I'm sorry, a good upper middle school. So that's her desk. That's her study desk. And we'll see that matters a lot. This is one of my colleagues from Beijing University with 3 little girls, showing them, quizzing them on finding places on the map of China. But the point is that they have a map in the household. So this is, again, in the same village. So that's just making concrete what is now a bunch of numbers. There are 2 things to say about these numbers. These are what are known, for those of you who know about such things, as metric coefficients. So it says that men, holding everything else constant, men average 1.6 years of schooling more than women. The other important number is that if you live, even if you have a rural registration, if you live in a city, you average about a year more, and if you have urban registration, a little bit more than a year more. Both parents, if you have a desk in the household, you average 0.8 of a year more in schooling, holding everything else constant. If one or both parents is a Communist Party member, you average a half a year more. And this is hard to interpret because it's the log of the number of books in the household at age 14. But as I point out at the bottom, the difference between having 1 book in the household and 100 books is an expected 4.6 years of schooling difference. Notice here, now these coefficients are directly comparable. They're standardized coefficients. The number of books in the household is far and away the most important determinant of educational attainment, much more important than the parents' average years of schooling. So much better to come from say a working class intellectual family than from a bookless, well-educated family. And this is the main thing that drives educational attainment in China these days. So, to get to the conclusions, the assumption that I make and that everybody else makes is that education matters for both development and justice. And then the data conclusion is that inequality of educational opportunity is decreasing over time and decreasing as nations develop. And the coefficients, the numbers, show that the effects are very strong. Some nations, particularly China and Taiwan, are doing much better than others, which bodes well for their future. And in particular, China is about to outstrip the U.S. This is a startling slide, and I think I'll send it to the White House. The thing is that average educational attainment has stopped in the United States for people who were age 10 to 14 around, roughly speaking, around 1964. And education has been rising and rising and rising. What I did was this graph goes beyond the data. The data stop here in the U.S. Or maybe I guess they stopped here in 1989. And so I said, well, this is pretty flat, so I just extended it on the assumption it will continue to be flat. And I took the difference between 1989 and 1994 and extended it for China. And that bouncing the line is, I think, because of the way it's state of mixed graphs. But basically, it shows that China is going to have a better educated population than the United States. These are people who, at the end, these are people who were 10 years old in 2009. And I'm sure the Chinese are happy about this, and Americans should be very worried about this. So that I thought I would leave you with this provocative graph and stop now since my time is up.
Great.
You want to help Irene get her?
Yeah. Thank you, Don, for a very interesting presentation and thought-provoking ending. Now let me introduce our discussant, Dr. Irene Ng. He's an assistant professor in social work in the National University of Singapore, and he's the executive director of Asia Pacific Journal of Social Work and Development. Her teaching and research areas include poverty, inequality, intergenerational mobility, youth crime, and social welfare policy. She sits in committees, quite a few committees, in the National Youth Council, the Chinese Development Assistance Council, and the Family Research Network. So let's welcome Dr. Irene.
Henry, we need you.
I think you're right.
Oh, we got it. She got it. Clever.
I try to keep my comments short because I think amongst us there are scholars of education as well as people who work in this area of work. So you guys might have more comments as well. I'm really impressed with Professor Treiman for being able to share with us this huge amount of research into like 40 minutes or so. If I may just summarize the key findings, I think two types of educational attainment he was looking at. One is the level of education, and I think tonight's presentation he focused more on that. And it looked to me that modernization impacted the level of education, and that females, right, really have improved a lot in terms of educational attainment. The other variable he was interested in, which he didn't spend that much time talking about, which I am very interested in, is on the educational opportunity, which he defined as the dependence of someone's educational attainment on the father's educational attainment. Right? And this looks to me to depend on the inequality in educational level, or not so much on modernity, but in terms of communist regime, right? The more communist regime tends to equate the opportunities more. Right? So in my reflections, when I received the earlier set of slides, I think I can break it into three parts. One is in terms of the context in which the study is based, and the second part is on methodology, and the third part is on trying to bring it to our Singapore experience. I've been told that tonight is supposed to be a public kind of event, so not to get too technical. So I'm trying to... Right, so the context to me seems most relevant in terms of thinking about economies that are in transition, especially with a focus on China, right? From industrialization from a less developed context, and also a political regime change from communism, out of communism. And as I thought about it, what are some other variables that could be interesting when you think about political economy? And I think Professor Treiman talked about the lack of data in terms of, say, GDP and other things. And I thought about economic sectors, right? How what's the size of your services or manufacturing sector, and these affect the distribution of wages, of occupational access, and also would affect educational attainment. So he mentioned that because his data goes back so long time, right, and you don't have these measures, perhaps it would be interesting not to go so way back, right? Because I think a lot of development happened, say, in the last 40 years, 70s or so, and it might be interesting to look at from that time point if you can get better variables. So with longitudinal data, I wonder whether it's also interesting to look at the timing of certain reforms, not just in terms of communism, because if we're interested to really learn about the sources of change that changes educational attainment in different countries and the access to education opportunities, it might be interesting to look at these timings of when. So, I mean, for example, in North America, in the Scandinavian countries, the educational reforms, the welfare reforms happened around the 70s. In Singapore, we don't have data for that, but from our Singapore experience, right, it's around that time too that they put in place a lot of these institutions. So, yeah, in terms of methodology, I thought other measures of political economy, maybe I'll just skip the second point because that was from looking at the slides. I wondered about how you reconcile the different types of occupations and the prestige attributed to each occupation in your huge data. Because if I remember Stella Kwa's work and her colleagues' work in Singapore in the 1980s when we tried to use Duncan's occupational prestige score here, we had problems trying to assign a number to occupations that doesn't exist in America, like medium hawker, you know. And I mean, in Singapore now, a hawker, the prestige level is so low, but maybe a hawker actually is very viewed highly in China or Taiwan even, I don't know. You know? So how do you reconcile that? Again, today, he didn't really focus on that relationship between inequality in education and educational opportunity, which is his beta in an earlier set of slides. I thought that the two might be endogenous. The term means they affect each other, rather than the effect is not from inequality to opportunity, but it could be because your education depends so much on your parents, and that's why that drives the inequality. You know, so I wonder whether there are other measures of educational inequality, especially in terms of the difference in the systems in different countries, because that seems to be what the study is interested in terms of the institutions. So, this thing about institutions and what's going on, in my own sharing about results from my studies on intergenerational mobility, I've often been asked, what do you think is going on? Why? Why is there so much dependence of children's income, occupational status, or education on parents? And I think Professor Treiman mentioned material capital as well as social capital, so I thought maybe I'll just share a bit more about how the research has shown how that might happen. Material capital-wise, it is simply that you have more resources to invest in the children, and just now we were shown, right, number of books matters, you know. And Jean Young herself has some research in this area. Social capital or cultural capital, right? There's research showing how middle-class parents really have a lot of concerted cultivation. They really put a lot of effort to go and put their children into CCAs and drive them there and cheer them on, whereas lower class parents, you know, just let it develop naturally. So the differences in terms of these capitals is set to shape some of this dependence in attainment. In my work now, I've also thought more about the role of the institutions, the political economy, and one of them is the school system. Since discovering this research out of Sweden, I've been sharing it everywhere I go. Sweden had an educational reform, and they postponed streaming by just 2 years, but they found that this improved intergenerational income mobility due largely to assortative mating, meaning that you marry someone of an equal status. And also, I feel like then this might speak to how the school is where you meet people with the connections, right? And I've recently been talking to Vincent Chua from the Sociology Department at NUS, because he's the social networks guy, to try and figure out how social networks in interaction with the school system affects social mobility, right, and educational opportunities and beyond. Right? So it could be networks in terms of who you meet that opens up opportunities, but it also could mean segregation, because it means that if you go to a certain school, you have those networks, but if you can't get to those schools, you don't have those networks. Right? So something to think about where, and that's the next thing that I hope we can try and understand more, because we have more understanding, I think, in terms of the other types of social capital, but not in terms of the networks and segregation kind of capital. Right, so in trying to apply this to Singapore, I felt like the findings in terms of the industrialization and political regime might reflect Singapore's experience immediately after we gained independence in 1965, where we established a national curriculum and teacher training, and then we built lots of schools. And so when we think about what's going on with modernization or change out of communist regime that equalizes educational opportunities or increases educational level, I feel like an important piece of the story is what kind of educational system is put in place. And in Singapore right now, we are actually moving from that standardized system that we put in place after independence to becoming one that's more differentiated. And this slide shows the different ways we have made our system more differentiated. We introduced streaming, right? Then we try and use this thing. Streaming. Then we had different types of programs like the gifted education program, which now has been postponed to a later age, not at primary 3. Oh no, it's still there. Then we introduced independent schools, autonomous schools, right? And in 2008 we introduced the integrated program. And my timeline stops here, but we continued on. Yeah, we've introduced different types of specialized schools, School of the Arts, sports schools, right? And this picture shows just how many different tracks that students in Singapore can go through. And we don't have data that shows the effect of these systems on our educational opportunity or thereafter. But my sense is that there would be effects on differentiating students and decreasing opportunity. But we do have data from the Program for International Students Assessment. This is an international test done in several countries. And I show you the top scores for 6 economies, highlighting Singapore, right? And Finland here, because Finland is quite well known for its education system and one that doesn't do streaming too much later, right? So while we score really high in terms of the test scores, Singapore doesn't fare so well in terms of the distribution. So our students score high on average, but the difference between the best student and the last student is quite wide. And this slide shows this, right? So the vertical axis is the mean reading score, the horizontal axis is the difference between the 90th and 10th percentile. This red line is the OECD average, and Singapore is on this side, meaning we are more unequal than the OECD average. Right? And this graph shows how much the PISA reading score depends on the socio-economic background. The horizontal axis shows the slope of the gradient, so the size of this dependence. The vertical axis shows the strength of the gradient, so the statistical significance of this. And you can actually just draw a straight upward sloping line, meaning that those that have a big effect size also are statistically stronger, right? And Singapore is out here. OECD average is here and Finland is here. So I think inequality in education in Singapore and opportunity, right? I think there are worrying trends towards that. Finally, I want to just show results from another colleague, Kong Wing, from the Department of Economics in NUS. He did, using the National Youth Survey, studying youth's educational level, how it's influenced by father's education, as well as father's earnings. So this is female, that's the father's earnings. Father's earnings is here, right? So this model has father's earnings, this model doesn't have. And he got about 0.27 years, which is, the number is smaller than what Professor Treiman showed, the average. His was 0.35. But I think Singapore is probably at the average, because this is for youth age 23, 29, and you still can continue to go and study some more after this age. I think it's only in the 30s that the educational attainment stabilized. And so I think it's probably about average compared to other countries. But this cohort, it was National Youth Survey 2002 and 2005 that he studied. They wouldn't have gone through the whole differentiation that I showed you just now, in terms of the streaming, the different types of programs, the different types of schools. They would have only experienced part of the streaming. So my last question to Professor Treiman is, what do you think will happen to educational opportunities in Singapore and around the world moving on from here? Thanks.